Good afternoon. It's 12 noon, and welcome to the Korea Society. We're delighted to have you here, both those in our studio audience here today, as well as those who are live streaming or watching via YouTube video or listening via audio podcast. It's a very pressing time in international relations, and we've seen today concerns in Syria and real division between Russia and the United States. But our focus of attentions today is really on the Russian role relative to the Korean Peninsula. We know there has just been a meeting between Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov and the North Korean Foreign Minister Ri Yong-ho in Moscow. There will be a return visit to Pyongyang. All of this in the buildup to the historic summit between the Inter-Korean summit between the two Korean leaders, and then the planned summit between U.S. President Donald Trump and North Korean leader Kim Jong-un. To help us in advance of the summit to understand where Russia sits is Anna Kireeva, who is a professor at IMIMO in Moscow. We're delighted to have her back. She was here for one of our Kim Koo Professional Series sessions last fall, and we were able to take advantage of her presence here in New York, and she's just been at the International Studies Association meeting in San Francisco. So Anna, welcome back to the United States. It's great to have you here on the stage at the Korea Society, and we are at a complex time in terms of the lead up to negotiations. And your thoughts initially, and we'll converse more on it, in terms of where Russia stands relative to its position on the Koreas, given this charm offensive by North Korea, and given the likelihood of some important summits coming up.
Thank you so much. Hello, everyone. It's really nice to be here. Thank you, Steve, for having me here and for organizing all this. It's really a pleasure and a great honor for me to be here for the second time already. Probably I would like to talk a little bit about what is Russia's position on the security on the Korean Peninsula. And one of the major things that I should say is that Russia's Far East geographically belongs to Asia. And that is the case why the security on the Korean Peninsula matters really a lot for Russia. And it's probably one of the greatest challenges and greatest potential threats with a very high impact that Russia is facing now and has faced for quite a long time, actually. So basically, Russia's position includes several points. The first is that Russia objects to the use of force and to the threats of use of force, as well as to any military action on the Korean Peninsula. And again, Russia shares a border with North Korea. This is a 17 kilometers border. And in case any military conflict happens, there could be also consequences for Russia. I mean, of course, for China, the consequences will be large scale, but not that for Russia. But still, Russia could also face the challenge, the threat of contamination of its territory and the flow of refugees, both by land and by sea. And that's why what Russia has been arguing for is having negotiations and trying to resolve this matter peacefully, only by peace and without any resort of force or, again, a threat to force. However, Russia is a strong proponent of nuclear non-proliferation regime, and it has condemned every missile and nuclear test by North Korea. Of course, it objects to a state acquiring nuclear capabilities outside the NPT. That's why Russia believes that the long-term, the ultimate goal should be denuclearization of the whole Korean Peninsula. Mm-hmm. And to this aim, there should be basically peace negotiations. Russia's major position here has been that there should be resumption of the SixParty Talks. as the Six-Party Talks has been seen as the only one format that could have all the parties actually at the table and could bring sustainable, a long-term solution to the problem. Probably another thing is that Russia also believes that there are some reasons for North Korea to care about its security, so that it's basically rational, not. And it has got its security concerns. And in order to settle this problem, what we actually need is also to cater for North Koreans' security concerns as well, because these particular concerns have actually prompted North Korea to develop its nuclear and missile program. And thus, the ultimate goal should be the creation of this security architecture in Northeast Asia that should include all the states, the U.S. allies as well as North Korea, and provide somehow for its security, alleviate its security concerns. Because if we do not do that, we would never settle this issue, actually, because North Korea would never abandon nuclear weapons if it feels threatened and if the current situation persists. So I guess these are kind of basic points.
Great. Thank you. That's a very comprehensive open. And in the context then of Vladimir Putin beginning his fourth term after the March 18th elections, do you think then that there will be this continued pivot to Asia and lean in? Is there viability in terms of negotiation, in terms of Russia's experience with North Korea, having laid infrastructure, having had a long political relationship with Pyongyang, as well as an extremely strong relationship with South Korea? And is there a potential future role as Seoul is managing a process and as Seoul's instincts toward negotiation seem to run fairly close to where Beijing and Moscow are, at least in terms of de-escalation of tensions and getting people to the table?
Thank you for your question. This is a very complex one. What we may call Russia's pivot to Asia, or Russia's turn to the East, as we also call it in Russia, it's not a new initiative, but it got kind of accelerated because it actually lacked progress, a lot of progress before the crisis with the West, but it kind of got accelerated after the rift of Russia's relations with the U.S. and Europe. So I guess it has been kind of strategic course. And again, one of the major things here is for Russia to achieve a more balanced foreign policy in general. Russia believes that it is one of the great powers and it should have good relations and good standings in regions where it geographically belongs to. It should be not only Europe but also Asia. And Asian dimension had been lagging behind the European one to really a large extent. That's why it's quite logical to try to enhance relations, to pivot more to the region which is which has been growing, actually. And probably another major reason is that the development of the Far East has been named by President Putin as Russia's priority for the 21st century, for the whole century. And the Far East is rather sparsely populated territory, and there is an urgent need for its development. So what Russia has been doing for several years, it introduced a special economic regime in the Far East, advanced special economic zones. Now there are 16 of them, as far as I remember, and Vladivostok is a free port, Porto Franco, again with a special economic regime. And actually what Russia hopes for is to attract investment from Asian states mostly, here, I think there is a lot of convergence between Russia's pivot to Asia and Moon Jae-in's foreign policy in general, and his new northern policy in particular. When Moon Jae-in came to the Eastern Economic Forum, the third one, September last year, they actually had very good talks, high-level talks with President Putin, and Moon Jae-in stated that South Korea would be would not miss the opportunity to cooperate with Russia in developing the Far East. And even there was a very interesting thought that this cooperation could pave the way for some trilateral cooperation with North Korea as well, because it could show the benefits to the North Korea of economic cooperation which takes place just near the border. To this aim, what Russia has been actually arguing, again, returning to your question, that there should be some economic projects on trilateral basis. And this, again, has been one of the major points of Russia's position. There has been 3 major projects indicated. They should be developed with the help of Russia, South Korea, and North Korea. Basically, we and North Korea connecting Russia and South Korea. Gas pipeline, and it makes sense for South Korea to have it. Electric power lines as well, and the railroad. And of these 3 projects, only the railroad, Hassan-Rajin, became a reality, although now it has been, of course, developing only as a Russia-North Korea project. But this is Russian railway station of Hassan, situated on the Trans-Siberian Railway, and North Korean port of Rajin, which is a non-freezing port, which is situated on the coast, on the North Korean coast. And this project specifically has been all this time in the UN sanctions as an exclusion, meaning that it may still be resumed. Russia actually may not increase its investment into this project, but it is still in place. South Korea even tried to also to employ this project in 2016, but after the tensions aggravated in 2016, Park Geun-hye pulled out of this project. But I mean, this is still kind of a way forward, a possible way forward here on the trilateral basis.
Sure.
And Russia, I think that here again, this idea makes sense from Russia's perspective. We cannot develop trust without any cooperation. So we need to have some cooperation in the first place in order to reduce tensions and to build up also for like some security and political dialogue as well. So probably it could be the way forward if we now can see some moves, real tangible moves here. Sure. Russia also really does welcome South-North Korea dialogue. And Russia believes that South-North Korea dialogue is of vital importance, and that the Korean issue cannot be settled actually without building trust between North and South and without this dialogue. And I guess what also Russia will be trying to do is to promote further Russian-Chinese roadmap, which was adopted July last year by Russia and China, Russian and Chinese foreign ministers, and then endorsed by Putin and Xi Jinping. This roadmap has 3 stages. The first one is dual freeze, the freeze of nuclear and missile tests by North Korea, in exchange for the freeze or downgrading of military exercises by US and South Korea. And this is what we probably saw during the Olympics in Pyeongchang. And what Russia hopes is that even the current military exercises, there has been some, kind of downgrade in order probably not to provoke North Korea too much. And I think what is really interesting is that North Korea is, at least up to date, has reacted in a very flexible way to this exercises, saying that now it understands that and it probably will not move to nuclear and missile exercises for nuclear missile tests itself for some time while some negotiations are in place. The second stage of this roadmap is actually now being kind of also happening. These are bilateral and multilateral dialogues between the parties on how to interact further. And North Korea-South Korea dialogue is probably the major here. And of course, the next should be US-North Korea dialogue. And Russia believes that without this dialogue, it will also be impossible to settle this issue. So the next step should be, again, from Russia's perspective, having the six-party talks again, the six-party format, so that no party is left out of decision-making, including Russia, including China and Japan, for example, as well. Of course, now we have kind of seen China's role on the Korean Peninsula restated, I should say, reinforced again. And there have been some speculations that probably there could be some kind of four-party format without Russia and Japan. And actually, Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov addressed this issue during after the talks, during the press release after the talks with North Korean Foreign Minister. And from his understanding, the Chinese side also supports the six-party format, not the four-party format. And presumably, there has been like an idea that North Korea would also like to have the six-party format.
Sure. And more guarantees. So, which leads to the question then of viewpoints from a North Korean perspective. And they look then at China and its mutual security treaty, and now with Kim Jong-un's visit to Xi Jinping, a reinforcement ahead of these summit talks. Clearly, in terms of the foreign minister visits in Moscow and the one anticipated in Pyongyang, reinforcement in terms of Russian backing. No doubt from a North Korean perspective, some strategic diversification, because historically, North Korea during the Cold War employed its relations with both Beijing and Moscow to its advantage, sometimes at the expense of the other, sometimes in coordination. But it's interesting to think of that compact as it's developing. It's also interesting to think in your first stages of what ultimately may be for an integrated or unified peninsula, a transportation corridor that runs from St. Petersburg to Busan and provides necessary energy to Japan, for that matter. And I should note that our good friends at the National Committee American Foreign Policy have just held a trilateral here in New York City among Russia, Japan, and the United States.
Right.
So all of that has a positive trajectory. What is not positive, or what we began to talk about before we stepped up to the stage, which is the very hard relationship now between the United States and Russia. And of course, for the South Koreans who enjoy a 70-year-long strong alliance with the United States, it must be a balancing act to some extent, as it is balancing relations between Beijing and Washington, and clearly maybe secondarily or tangentially more with Moscow. But, its major relationship really is defined vis-a-vis the U.S. And so when the relationship between Russia and the United States is as bad as it is right now, over many issues, over Syria, which is unfolding in a different dynamic today, which was with likely missile strikes, as we've seen this week on the floor of the UN Security Council. In terms of last Friday's sanctions announced against Russian business leaders, that are having very serious economic implications for Russia, for the ruble, for the markets, and potentially for average Russian citizens as prices for consumer goods increase. And then, of course, Crimea and eastern Ukraine, and the differences with NATO. So a very complex menu of differences. And one might have hoped that the Korean Peninsula could stand out as an area for cooperation, maybe still will, maybe at some point when U.S.-Russia relations improve. But I wondered if you had thoughts on how that particular bilateral relationship is impacting Asia, or Putin's tilt to Asia, economic or political solutions that help Russia away from the conundrum toward Europe and with the United States, and how that might be executed in a way that maybe helps U.S.-Russia relations eventually, or helps the process of de-escalation of tensions and negotiation around the Korean Peninsula.
This is, I think, a very timely question, actually. Again, as you noticed before that, Russia is, well, in rather a favorable position, having good relations with South Korea, which have, well, arguably now gained new momentum after the transition, the power transition to Jae-in in South Korea, and has had, I should probably say, stable working relations with North Korea, probably even more stable at the working level than relations with China used to be for several years, at least before the visit here of Kim Jong-un to Beijing. And of course, this position also has been one of the major Russia's position not to take sides in major security conflicts, in major disputes in Asia, and to try to have cooperation with all the sides and bring them to the table again. This is what Russia has been trying to do for the Korean Peninsula. I would argue that Russia would like to play a role here, probably as well as China, of kind of an intermediary in the Korean matters. But a lot of this will depend on Russia-U.S. relations for sure. I mean, China-U.S. relations, I think, as well, to a large extent, especially with the speculations about trade wars possible. So it could also bring some chaos into this process. Well, Russia-U.S. relations, for sure, they have been for quite a long time moving towards a very negative trajectory. I don't know if we are reaching for the kind of the bottom yet or not. Probably there is still something to undermine. We could only hope that there will be no military escalation in Syria, because in this case I have no idea what could actually happen. But I think that even despite the sanctions imposed by the United States against Russia, Lavrov, again, in the press release after the talks with North Korean foreign minister, also welcomed U.S.-North Korea dialogue. Even despite that, even despite the tensions, again, consistent with Russia's perspective that all the parties should be brought to the table. I think what has been real Russia's concern about possible talks and agenda for talks, that even if we have SixParty Talks resumed, one of the major points here is what all the sides would be ready to compromise for. There has been a lot of publications by Russia's experts on Korea looking at the U.S. current policy and U.S. current stance, and emphasizing that there is no idea what the U.S. could actually bring itself to the table apart from its claim that there should be complete and verifiable destruction of nuclear weapons. Just apart from these demands, what could be the things that U.S. itself could be able to compromise on? And I think there is also this idea that there should be some compromise made on all the sides if we want to achieve some solution. I mean, it's not necessary just to push for North Korea. It would be also necessary to give some incentives for North Korea as well. And here probably it's a very tricky issue. Even if there. I think there are still no clear understanding if there are preconditions for Kim-Trump meeting or not. probably, I don't know if you agree with me or not, there has been statements by the U.S. officials that North Korea will need to prove its seriousness in its ambition to denuclearize. And if it doesn't prove, even probably the meeting may not take place eventually. I think that in Russia's perspective here, all the sides should be thinking of what they could bring on the table and what could they compromise on.
Yeah. And so this weekend we heard through unnamed White House sources, as reported in the press, that North Korea indeed has committed to the talks. And so where we had not heard pronouncements from the North Koreans themselves, that seems to have been somewhat assuaged, at least in terms of U.S. Communications, as reported. However, we have a shift in Washington now, as you well know, with a new national security advisor in John Bolton, a likely new Secretary of State in Mike Pompeo. So what is widely perceived as a harder line national security team leading in. And I wonder if, as my final question to you, if you could give us some insight into how you see Russian policymaking toward this area now. Do you feel Russia's on a tangent that's really very positive in terms of its engagement with the peninsula? You've given us lots of rationale for what it hopes to do. But I think people here in our audience or watching or listening probably are less familiar with the complexities of Russian foreign policy making. So I just didn't know if, as an EMIMO professor, do you have some thoughts on how policy is made, or is there something that we should understand, or relative to the assertion I just made about the hardening of the U.S. national security team? And is that a concern in Moscow?
I should say that there is concern, of course, about the U.S. national security strategy and the increase in defense spendings, and especially, as well aimed against Russia. I think it seems that at least the perception in Russia is, the basic perception in Russia is that the United States labeling Russia as revisionist powers was one of the key threats, has been undermining bilateral relations. And I guess that Russia would probably be better with having some talk with the United States, although, of course, we do not understand now how flexible both sides could be. But probably how we could interpret latest claims by President Putin about new weapon systems, for example, as well, that are able to, to reach the U.S. anyway, despite the missile defense, and they are actually aimed at bypassing this defense. They could also probably be interpreted as that Russia wants to improve its bargaining power in order to engage in some negotiations with the United States. Of course, there has been lots of criticism and of the U.S. actions, and I think what Russia has really been opposing to is any military scenario on the Korean Peninsula. That's sure not in Russia's interest at all. Russia's positions would suffer anyway. So I guess that basically Russia has been labeling U.S. Actions and rhetorics before this warming of relations as very aggressive, basically. As far as foreign policy making is concerned, I guess major decisions are taken by the president himself and the presidential administration, the top of foreign minister as well, of course. I guess that now this issue still was basically separated from the worsening trend of bilateral relations, which is probably a good thing. But if if the situation, if relations escalate between Russia and US, it could also have some probably negative repercussions for the Korean Peninsula, at least in Russia's view.
Sure.
But basically, it's very hard to predict if we can actually reverse this downturn,
Right.
this trend, and what do we need to do in order to achieve this?
Yeah, that's a very positive vision. I know for many scholars of international relations, we've looked at some of the developments with real concern. The United States National Security Strategy of 2017, the National Defense Strategy of 2018, the Nuclear Posture Review, all position U.S. concerns vis-a-vis Russia and China, so that a move back to sort of a state-centric reality has dominated, and that gives us pause.
And actually, Russia, I think that to most part, Russia has taken no very active steps to balance US in Asia, for example, and this has been kind of driving Russia closer to China again.
Right, sure, and also obviously as concerns about Russia are a U.S. domestic issue now, with the investigations, with concerns about meddling in the 2016 elections. All of this will have to play out clearly for foreign policy avenues to open up. I know there's also been concern in terms of the way that weaponry has been touted. You referenced Putin's mention of new capabilities.
Yeah.
Some people discounted that as a lead up to the elections and sort of done for domestic consumptions. Others argued against the technical capabilities. Some people pointed to Donald Trump's mention of larger buttons and now the mention of smart missiles relative to Syria just in his tweet today as a bit of brinksmanship or machismo that may not be healthy for the process of enhanced international understanding. So words and these gestures do matter, and hopefully our leaderships might rein in on some of that.
But I still guess that Russia is trying to bring the US to the table, meaning that we now do have to negotiate. We have something to negotiate with.
And I know, some of our friends on the West Coast and luminaries such as former Defense Secretary Bill Perry, former Secretary of State George Shultz, and others have called for revisiting the Nunn-Lugar commitments and trying to get back to a reduction of nuclear weaponry, and all of that is incredibly important for world peace. I just wanted to end with my own observation to you that I began to lecture at the Russian Diplomatic Academy and meet with the North Korean experts in 1996. And I've always felt that there is a brain trust on North Korea that is extremely valuable. And I know that wherever there can be interface academically and hopefully in time at diplomatic levels, there may be some real solutions because there is a long history of Russia with North Korea.
Yeah, and now it's actually 70 years. This year is 70 years of Russia-North Korea relations.
Right. So perhaps we will see a Kim Jong-un sit down with Putin, or perhaps in time.
I guess, again, if we compare Russia to China, Russia even has one advantage probably in North Korea's eyes. North Korea has been rather wary of China and China's policy since 2013, especially, right? China doesn't want to be dominated by China, basically. And as China accounts for most of North Korea's trade, even now, even despite the sanctions, China does have leverage. Russia doesn't. We do have contacts on the working level, not on high level, but as our trade is small, it's extremely small. It's less than $100 million, and last year it was also about $80 million. It's very insignificant, and in North Korea's eyes, it could be that Russia could be probably be considered a better intermediary in terms of that it cannot have substantial leverage on North Korea or try to make actually North Korea do something, because we do not have this leverage, at all. But thus still Russia takes into consideration North Korean security security challenges, and that there is a need to provide for North Korea's security as well as for other states, including the US, Japan, South Korea, and China, of course.
Yeah. And I did want to close on one second note, too, which was that since you've just come from San Francisco, I also was out there the week before you were and was extremely impressed in visiting Fort Ross, which is a Russian settlement an hour and a half north of San Francisco, and watching Stanford University students, other students from the United States, a large cadre of Russian students, and a few from other countries. They had 9 countries represented, working together, because it's a narrative that is far different from what we hear in the Washington-New York corridor and in terms of the current impasses between Washington and Moscow. And that effort, supported by the Fort Ross Conservancy, by Russia's Renova Fort Ross Foundation, and other Transneft and other businesses, is incredibly important. And I remember being at the U.S.-Russia Business Council here and listening to Sergei Lavrov and John Kerry both call for cooperation among Russian business leaders for public-private partnership on preservation efforts like that. And in seeing the Stanford students and the Russian students talking about a common future, something very hopeful, and I know they continue that dialogue at Stanford just this most recent week. So I certainly hope for further impulses like that, but I thought it was important to share with our audience that that is another facet in what is happening here that is different from the dominant narrative that our media delivers.
And our university also does have cooperation, as far as I know, with Taft School. Now there have been programs when American students came to our university, and we did have some joint program with them. And what caught my eye actually is that San Francisco looks like a lot like Vladivostok, Russia's city in the Far East. And there have been so many ties between them. I personally have been to Vladivostok 3 times already, including this year. And I knew it only from the Russian part, but now I could kind of feel it from the US part. And there have been a lot of ties, both on people-to-people contacts and business contacts as well. And I guess that many Russians in the Far East would like the US again to improve its positions in the Far East, to again have its larger stake than it has now, especially if we compare it to a decade ago or 2 decades ago. Yeah.
And I know my former professor at the Fletcher School, now Professor Emeritus John Curtis Perry, has written extensively about that Vladivostok to San Francisco corridor and the potential for cooperation. But I would like to turn to the studio audience, and I know there will be some tough questions, I'm sure by way of sanctions, by way of Russia in the Security Council, and others, so we're prepared for any range of questions here. We have about 20 minutes remaining, but why don't we start in the front and then we'll move to the middle. If you would just identify yourself and your organization, that would be great.
Sure. Ariana King, I'm a reporter with the Nikkei Asian Review. I was particularly interested in what you were saying about the significant differences between Russia and China. It seems like Russia maybe even has more clout with the North Koreans. But I'm wondering how this would translate into the 6-party talks format versus the 4-party. Who benefits from the 6-party talks? You mentioned that China might want that, but what does Russia being there help China?
Thank you. Yeah, this is a very good question, I should say. What I was actually trying to say is that it's not that Russia has more clout. China has more clout because of its economic ties with North Korea. But Russia, specifically because of that, North Korea could look up to Russia for a more neutral intermediary role. Of course, you may call it like this is too positive, that these are too positive visions. But if we do have some multilateral talks in the end, the role of more neutral intermediary would be great in order to persuade North Koreans do something and to make them understand that, because they still can be wary of China to a large degree. Even, I mean, we could hope that economic ties could now improve, probably, and political relations between China and North Korea, and that China could persuade North Korea to do something. But from what I see in the last several years, North Koreans have been specifically concerned that they do not want to be subordinate to China in political terms, in security terms as well. So this was what I actually meant, that probably it will be unfair to say that Russia has a lot of clout. I don't think that. But again, a little bit counterintuitively, there could be a role here.
SixParty Talks.
Yeah. Actually, I mean, naturally, who would benefit from SixParty Talks? Russia and Japan. The countries that are not, won't be the party of four-party talks. That's why probably we could see some very quick moves by Shinzo Abe to arrange a meeting with Kim Jong-un as well, not to be left out, and so that the fate of the Korean Peninsula not to be decided by all other powers without Japan. And of course, it's of utmost importance for Russia to have its positions in the SixParty talks, because I mean otherwise again Russia won't have any other options but to accept what actually could happen here. I think it will also be kind of illustrative. This example also kind of a test for Russia-China strategic partnership, probably on the Chinese side, if China would really like to incorporate Russia in the SixParty talks, if it would really support Russia's inclusion. Again, it's a little bit hard to judge how things would be going on, but Russia's foreign minister at least said that he had talks with his Chinese counterpart, and his Chinese counterpart, Wang Yi, assured him that they also want Russia at the table. And I guess here Russia and Chinese positions, they share most in common, I guess. About more than 90% probably of Russia's and China's positions are in common. There are slight probably divergences, but in most part, China could also benefit from somebody supporting peace talks, denuclearization of the whole peninsula, and also caring for concerns of all parties. So this could be like that.
Thank you, Anna. Please.
Thank you, John Koch. I'm a political historian. I'd like to try and connect the historical with the contemporary. You know, President Trump is fond of saying that Barack Obama founded ISIS, which may or may not be true. But it's certainly true that Russia founded North Korea. However, that result came about because of the failure of negotiations between the U.S. and then the Soviet Union to form a provisional government. So in a sense, the U.S. and Russia are joined at the hip on Korea. Taking that one step further into the contemporary dimension, you mentioned Nunn-Lugar. Could that be a prototype for if denuclearization were to occur, it would be only logical for the nuclear powers to supervise it. So Russia being a neighbor would be the obvious choice, and working with the U.S., having had the experience of working with the U.S. on denuclearization after the collapse of the Soviet Union, this would be an obvious choice under some kind of UN mandate. Of more immediate concern, though, is the fact that I don't know how many people are aware of the fact that President Putin was able to achieve a 3-year moratorium with Kim Jong-un's father on missiles in 1999. And it's really too bad that Syria is blocking productive cooperation between the two countries. You mentioned Vladivostok. Vladivostok, if again, aside from Syria, would be an obvious choice for a location for a meeting.
Yeah, sure.
Since Kim Jong-un was not a world traveler, he wouldn't have far to go. And Trump would be in good company given his current kind of bromance with Putin. So I'd just like you to comment on the possibility of a Vladivostok location for the summit, and what you might think of a Russian role in terms of denuclearization, which is at the heart of any kind of six-party or four-party talks. And by the way, the reason the six-party talks collapsed was because they were unable to sequence the denuclearization with the various other assurances that were on the table. So take it from there. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Actually, I do agree. And again, as Steve said just before that, I think that Asia, and especially the issue of North Korea, is one of the maybe now very few issues where Russia's and US interests are not that different. They diverge much less than on Europe, Ukraine, or Syria, for example. And East Asia could be potentially the greatest area actually for cooperation. And I guess one of the major things that Russia and US specifically, even probably not the other parties, but specifically Russia and US do have in common, this is their position to North Korea becoming a nuclear state and undermining the non-proliferation regime. That's why I think Russia, I absolutely agree with you with its expertise, would be happy to contribute to denuclearizing North Korea. Russia's position is that it should be basically carried within IAEA, actually, under its auspices, so that there should be some international body to provide for this. I guess that Russia has been one of the key parties in what could be seen as complete reversible denuclearization of Korea. For the location of the meeting, I think there has been several speculations that it could be China, South Korea, including the DMZ, and it could be Switzerland or Europe in some way, or of course it could be Vladivostok. And the chance for that is probably not that high if we look at the current tensions in Russia-US relations. I mean, of course, Russia would be happy to host this summit in Vladivostok and to provide a venue for that. And before that, there were also speculations that this could be a place for North-South dialogue as well, for example. But the tricky thing is if Trump would come amidst the current tensions, just because of domestic opposition, I don't think, in the US itself, I don't think that this is very likely.
Yeah, that's correct. On the domestic equation, one thing I've reminded a few of my Scandinavian colleagues lately is if this summit takes place between Trump and Kim Jong-un, and if those two pronounce it a success, and if when Jae-in pronounces this a success, it's actually the opposite of what most things are, processes that lead to presidential or leadership level summits. It would be a leadership summit that leads to a process. And so there will be the necessity for many follow-on fora and meetings. So we may hear the suggestion of many of those places for follow-on
But basically,
activity.
it's a short way from Pyongyang to Vladivostok, and this could be the chance. And what I also wanted to say, I think that Russia's foreign ministry and Russia's experts have pointed repeatedly to the declarations reached at the SixParty Talks in 2005-2006, where North Korea agreed to abandon its nuclear weapons in return for security guarantees and in return for light water reactors to be installed as really kind of an example that some compromise could be reached with North Korea. The problem was that there was no implementation of that. So I think that Russia still regards these declarations as a good foundation for possible talks now as well.
Let me ask, since we are starting to run short on the hour, do we have any questions from any of our student delegation here today?
So you talked about sort of how Russia and China have been drifting closer together over the years. So I want to ask, like, in the context of these talks, in the context of the sort of close relations between the two countries, how do you think Russia will see these talks as a way to sort of, affect their strategy with China? I mean, China's been seeking, one can even say, dominance in East Asia, and Russia, as you said, wants to see itself as a superpower. So in order to stay relevant, in order to, not become one of these Chinese dominees, what is Russia's take on this? What is Russia's strategy vis-a-vis China in these talks? I guess is my question.
Thank you so much. And from what university are you?
St. Anne's School, High School.
Okay, great to see you. I believe that this should be, we should better look at it as a part of Russia's strategy in Asia in general and strategic partnership with China. On the one hand, Russia and China have drawn really very close together, and we do enjoy very, good political and security relations with a very good rapport between the leaders, Putin and Xi Jinping. However, I do agree with you that Russia would not like to have China-dominated East Asia. And what Russia would like to see in Asia is a polycentric regional order. I think, again, as the polycentric world order and polycentric regional order, with Russia as one of the stakeholders, with one of the major powers, but not like dominance of any other power, be it the US or China, for example. And that's why I think for Russia it's of vital importance to ensure that it is at the six-party format, that it is on the table. Because if Russia is left out of these negotiations, then it would probably mean that that Russia cannot achieve this goal of presenting itself as one of the centers of power, as one of the powers that is to be reckoned with in East Asia. So that's why I think Russia would try to work with China also, and with North Korea and South Korea as well, to ensure that it is invited to the table. Probably the US would not really care if Russia is invited or not, in the most positive view. But I guess that Russia would try to work with these states. And actually, we during the last attempts of six-party talks, North Korea was very keen on having Russia as well at the table. So we could hope that this visit by North Korea's foreign minister to Russia and talks with Lavrov, and that Lavrov said that he would visit Pyongyang and accepted the invitation, that it could symbolize that North Korea also wants Russia to be one of the key parties here.
Former Mongolian President Elbegdorj has suggested Ulaanbaatar as a site.
Yes,
and of course, that relationship between Mongolia and Russia is quite important, and yet another way to try to strike at a regional dynamic. Let me close then with a question from Dame Giuseppe Capriati of the Foreign Policy Association.
You haven't mentioned the role, if any, that Japan could play. Japan is an ally of the United States, a friend of South Korea. So what role could they play in this game of chess that the Korean Peninsula has become?
Thank you very much for your question. I guess that as Russia believes that there should be a six-party format, so that Japan would also be not left out of these negotiations. And this is, I think, quite positive for Japan. And there is now, a very positive trend in Russia-Japan relations still going on. We could call it kind of rapprochement probably between the powers based on the decision of the both leaders. And I get that Russia here has been trying to comprehensively now improve relations with Japan, not only in economic terms, but also in politics and security. And we have seen a lot of security contacts lately resumed, such as 2+2 meetings and others. So I guess that what Russia would like to see here is Japan also contributing to the negotiations in its way. But what could be a tricky moment here is that for Abe, the abduction issue, the issue of abduction of Japanese citizens by the North Korean government has been one of the key center moments for these negotiations. And as far as I remember, he particularly called Trump and talked with him to ensure that this issue is on the agenda of the summit, and then again contacted North Koreans, again rising up this issue that it needs to be settled at these negotiations. I guess from Russia's, well, at least from the perspective of Russia's experts, mostly raising up the issue of the abductees during the SixParty Talks on the denuclearization and possible security architecture is not very productive. Because these are kind of bilateral issues that need to be settled bilaterally, but they should not be brought up into negotiations as a prerequisite, for example, for any solution of this issue. So I guess what Russia would like to see would be also Japan-North Korea dialogue. But bilateral dialogue, for example, on this issue and Japan's participation here. And again, I think what Russia has been concerned about is that both Japan and South Korea, especially Japan, have long been argued for maximum pressure on North Korea. I mean, now under Jae-in, we do have the change in South Korea's policy in order to engage North. But what if we see some shift in Japan's position as well? I'm not pretty sure now how it develops. But I guess that we need to step aside from this on the maximum pressure if we want to have some results. I mean, otherwise we probably would not have any results anyway.
And it is worth noting that this upcoming meeting between Abe and Trump will again return Japanese position to fuller attention. Yeah. All of these segments leading up to the Inter-Korean Summit and the U.S.-North Korea Summit, should it take place, are all complex and very fast moving. It has been a very tight window here for a lot of important developments. So thank you, Professor Kireeva, for really providing great insight to us on Russia's position. You always have a place here at the Korea Society to share your views, and we were very grateful for your last presentation on China-Russia-Korea relations, as well as your discussion for our Kim Koo Professional Series Fellows on Russia-South Korea relations. Yeah. So all wonderfully done, and we really appreciate your time here today. If we could give a round of applause to Professor Kireeva. I'd like to thank you for your time and attention, to our Associate Director of Policy, Jonathan Corrado, who takes care of all of the logistics and has provided vital support, to our intern, Clarissa, and to two of our great staff members who joined us here today, or three actually, Angela Rhee and Chloe Byun of our Development Division, and my fellow Senior Director, Jane Kim, here in the front row. And we're very grateful for all the Korea Society team efforts. They do an amazing job. And
thank
to Peter
you so
Stemke,
much.
Thank you. And to Peter Stemke in our booth at the back, who makes all of the great audio and video happen. Please see us at koreasociety.org for podcasts and other updates, as well as a great deal of information, especially as the summit process is unfolding. And we look forward to seeing you back for future programs and having you, if you're not already, as members. So please see us at koreasociety.org or speak with Chloe and Angela at the back. So again, thank you all, and to our students, thanks for taking the time. It's great to have you here with our very distinguished foreign policy crowd. All the best. Thanks,
Thank you.
Anna.
Thank you so much.